Picture this. You're standing in a cathedral at dawn, but something is wrong. The light filtering through the stained glass isn't golden. It's grey, cold, almost hungry. The air tastes of metal and fear, and in the shadows between the pillars, something moves that shouldn't be there. Something that makes the monks whisper prayers they've never learned and cross themselves with trembling hands. This isn't fiction. This is October 13th, 1307. The day the church claimed the darkness moved. The day an entire order of warrior monks vanished from history in a single coordinated strike that would make modern intelligence agencies weep with envy. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. The Knights Templar weren't just arrested for heresy or greed or political convenience. They were eliminated because they had found something. Something that made the Pope himself lose sleep. Something that threatened to unravel the very fabric of Christian doctrine. You've heard fragments before. Friday the 13th, cursed treasure, secret rituals. But beneath the Hollywood mystique lies a story so dark, so carefully buried, that even today certain Vatican archives remain sealed. Not classified, sealed. There's a difference. And that difference might just explain why an order that once commanded the respect of kings and the fear of armies could be erased from existence in a single morning. So settle in. Turn off the lights if you're brave enough. Because what you're about to discover isn't just history. It's a warning. And it begins not with swords or gold, but with silence. The kind of silence that follows when something holy becomes something else entirely. The year was 1291. The last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land had fallen. Acre, that jewel of Crusader ambition, lay in smoking ruins. The Templars, those white-mantled warriors who had carved their legend into the stones of Jerusalem, found themselves without a purpose, or so the world believed. But legends don't die easily. They adapt, they evolve, and sometimes they discover things that were meant to stay buried. What the Templars brought back from their final retreat wasn't gold or silver or precious stones. It was knowledge, ancient knowledge, the kind that makes men's hair turn white overnight and sends bishops fleeing to their private chapels to pray for forgiveness for sins they haven't yet committed. Because you see, during their 2 centuries in the Holy Land, the Templars hadn't just been protecting pilgrims. They had been digging, excavating, learning. And what they learned changed everything. Beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, in chambers that predated Christ himself, they found texts, scrolls, artifacts, things that whispered of truths the church had spent centuries trying to forget. Documents that spoke of different gospels, alternative histories, bloodlines that stretched back to times when gods walked among men, and the line between heaven and earth was as thin as parchment. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. The Templars didn't just find these things, they understood them, they began to practice them, and slowly, quietly, they began to change. Knights who had once been model Christians started exhibiting behaviours that made their confessors weep. They spoke of visions that came not from God, but from something older, something that predated the cross and the crown alike. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, wasn't just a military leader. He was a keeper of secrets, a guardian of knowledge so dangerous that it could shatter the foundations of medieval society. And by 1306, word of that knowledge had reached the ears of Pope Clement V. But Clement, despite his holy office, was a practical man. He knew that some secrets are too dangerous to confront directly. So he made a deal with a king who needed money and a church that needed silence. King Philip IV of France was drowning in debt. The Templars held his notes, controlled his finances, and whispered in the corridors of power about truths that made his royal blood seem like water in comparison. Philip needed their wealth, but more importantly, he needed their secrets buried so deep they would never see light again. And the Pope, that supposed shepherd of souls, gave him the ecclesiastical blessing to make it happen. The plan was elegant in its brutality. Simultaneous arrests across France. Every Templar stronghold, every commandery, every safe house would be raided at the same moment. No warnings, no escape routes, no survivors who could carry their secrets into exile. It was a masterpiece of medieval coordination that would have made Julius Caesar himself applaud. But coordination requires preparation, and preparation leaves traces. The church began its campaign months before the arrests. Whispers in confession booths about Templar blasphemies, rumors in marketplaces about unholy rituals, stories that grew like cancer through the Christian world, preparing the faithful for what was to come. The Templars were no longer protectors, they were corruptors. They were no longer holy warriors. They were servants of something that made even demons flee in terror. The accusations were specific, terrifyingly specific. The Templars were said to worship a severed head called Baphomet. They allegedly spat on the cross during initiation ceremonies. They practiced rituals that involved kissing in places that would make a prostitute blush. But most damning of all, they claimed to possess knowledge that made the church's teachings seem like children's fairy tales. Here's what's chilling about these accusations. They weren't random. They weren't the usual grab bag of heretical charges thrown at convenient enemies. They were surgical, precise, as if whoever crafted them knew exactly what the Templars had been doing behind closed doors, as if someone had been watching, listening, documenting, preparing for the moment when silence would become necessary. The date was chosen with care. October 13th, 1307, a Friday, the day when Christ had died upon the cross, when darkness had covered the earth and the temple veil had been torn in two. It was symbolism wrapped in practicality, theology disguised as politics. And at dawn, across France, it began. The arrests were swift, brutal, efficient. Templars who had once commanded armies found themselves chained like common criminals. Fortresses that had withstood Saracen sieges opened their gates to French soldiers without a fight. It was as if the order had simply given up, as if they had been expecting this moment, as if they had been preparing for it. But here's where the official story begins to crack, because some of the Templars didn't resist. They didn't flee. They didn't even seem surprised. They walked to their cells with the calm of men who had already made peace with their fate, as if arrest was preferable to something else, something worse, something that waited in the shadows between the cathedral pillars, hungry and patient, and endlessly, eternally dark. The interrogations began immediately. But these weren't the crude beatings you might expect from medieval justice. These were something far more sophisticated, far more terrifying. The church had learned techniques from the Inquisition, methods that could break a man's mind while leaving his body intact. And they needed the Templars to talk, not just to confess, but to reveal what they had found beneath Jerusalem's ancient stones. Brother Gerard de Villiers was among the first to break, not from torture, but from something else entirely. The interrogators had shown him a piece of parchment, a single page covered in symbols that seemed to writhe in the candlelight, and Gerard had begun to weep. Not tears of pain, but tears of recognition, because he knew those symbols. He had seen them carved into the walls beneath the Temple Mount. He had watched them glow with their own inner light during ceremonies that had nothing to do with Christ's message of love and redemption. What Gerard revealed in that dungeon cell would make hardened bishops flee their posts and seek refuge in remote monasteries. He spoke of rituals conducted at midnight in chambers that echoed with voices speaking languages that predated Babel. He described artifacts that hummed with energies that made holy water boil and sacred relics crack. But most terrifying of all, he confessed to knowledge. Knowledge of what lay sleeping beneath the foundations of the Christian world. Knowledge of what the Templars had awakened. The head they called Baphomet wasn't an idol carved from stone or cast in metal. It was something else entirely. Something that whispered truths that made the gospel seem like comforting lies told to children afraid of the dark. Gerard described how it would speak to them during their secret ceremonies, revealing secrets about the nature of divinity that turned their stomachs and filled their dreams with visions of worlds where Christ had never walked and crosses burned with black fire. But Gerard's confession raised more questions than it answered. Because if the Templars had truly found something so dangerous beneath Jerusalem, why hadn't they destroyed it? Why had they brought it back to France? And most disturbing of all, if they possessed knowledge that could shake the very pillars of heaven, why had they surrendered so easily to King Philip's soldiers? The answer came from an unexpected source. Brother Thomas de Charnay, nephew of the infamous Geoffrey, who would later burn alongside Jacques de Molay, provided testimony that made even his interrogators cross themselves in terror. The Templars hadn't just found something beneath the Temple Mount. They had made contact with it. And that contact had changed them in ways that went beyond heresy, beyond blasphemy, beyond anything the Church had words to describe. Thomas spoke of knights who no longer cast shadows in sunlight, of brothers who could walk through walls as if they were made of morning mist, of ceremonies where the very air seemed to thicken with presence, where reality bent and twisted like heated metal. The Templars hadn't just discovered ancient knowledge. They had been transformed by it, made into something that was no longer entirely human. This explains the ease of their capture. They hadn't resisted because they no longer feared death. Death, Thomas revealed, was simply another doorway, another passage to explore. And what waited beyond that doorway was something the Church had spent centuries trying to convince the faithful didn't exist. Something that made hell seem like a pleasant vacation destination. The trials that followed were theatrical productions designed to justify what had already been decided. The Templars would confess to heresy, blasphemy, and corruption. They would surrender their wealth to the crown and their secrets to the flames. And then they would die, taking their knowledge with them into whatever realm awaited those who had peered too deeply into mysteries that were meant to remain sealed. But the Church had made a critical error. They had assumed that all the Templars' secrets could be contained within France. They had forgotten about the Order's international network, their commanderies in England, Scotland, Portugal, and the German states. They had forgotten that some secrets are too large to kill with a single coordinated strike. On the morning of October 13th, as French soldiers rounded up Templars across the kingdom, strange reports began filtering in from across Europe. Churches in London reported their bells ringing at midnight without human touch. Monasteries in Scotland described shadows moving independently of their owners, and in the remote highlands, shepherds spoke of lights that danced beneath the earth, pulsing with rhythms that matched no earthly heartbeat. The darkness, it seemed, was not content to remain buried. It was spreading, moving, seeking new hosts, new vessels, new servants to carry its ancient message into a world that had forgotten how to listen to voices that spoke from beyond the veil of ordinary reality. Pope Clement had claimed the darkness moved on that October morning, but he had been wrong about one crucial detail. The darkness hadn't moved because of the arrests. The darkness had moved because something far older and far more patient had finally found the opportunity it had been waiting for. The Templars' destruction hadn't contained the threat. It had released it. And in the years that followed, as the last of the Templars burned at their stakes and their ashes scattered to the winds, sensitive souls across Europe would report the same recurring dream. A vision of white-mantled figures walking through walls, through time, through the barriers between worlds, carrying torches that burned with light that cast no shadows, and whispered secrets that made the dreamer wake screaming prayers in languages they had never learned. Never learned. So here we stand, centuries later, still feeling the tremors of that October morning when the Church claimed the darkness moved, The Knights Templar weren't just destroyed that day, they were erased, written out of history, their secrets buried beneath layers of official doctrine and convenient lies. But some truths are too powerful to stay buried forever. The next time you walk through an old cathedral and feel that inexplicable chill, the next time shadows seem to move independently of their sources, remember what you've learned here today. The Templars found something beneath Jerusalem that changed them, transformed them, made them into vessels for knowledge that the Church feared more than hell itself. And when that knowledge was released into the world through their destruction, it didn't disappear. It adapted. It waited. It endured. History tells us the Templars were eliminated for political convenience and royal greed. But history, as we've seen, has a talent for comfortable lies. The truth is far more unsettling. The truth is that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. Some darkness, once awakened, never truly sleeps again. Friday the 13th remains cursed not because of superstition, but because of memory. The memory of the day when something ancient and patient finally found its freedom. And if you listen carefully on quiet nights, in the spaces between prayers and the silence between heartbeats, you might just hear the echo of white mantles moving through shadows that exist in places where light was never meant to shine. The darkness moved that day, and it's been moving ever since.